Now Eli the priest, his daughter-in-law, Phinehas's wife, was with child, due to be delivered, and when she heard the news that the ark of God was captured by the Philistines, and that her father-in-law and her husband were dead, she bowed herself and gave birth, for her labor pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the woman who stood by her said to her, "Do not fear, for you have borne a son." But she did not answer, nor did she regard it. And then she named the child Ichabod, saying, "The glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God has been captured, and because her father-in-law and her husband." And she said, "The glory is departed from Israel, for the ark of God has been captured." Get your coffee. In the middle of the 8th century BC, the Jewish king Uzziah died. The death of a nation's monarch, their leader, whether in our day or in the ancient world of Israel in 740 BC, it's a big deal whenever it is. You can be certain that Uzziah's death shook the people of his day. But actually, the lead up to the death of Uzziah was rather earth-shaking as well. Uzziah had been a good king, relatively speaking. Many of the kings of Israel were not very good, but Uzziah had a fairly long and mostly good reign, right until he didn't. About a decade before his death, the Old Testament book of 2 Chronicles records this: "When Uzziah was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. In his pride, Uzziah decided to enter into the temple of God to burn incense on the altar of incense." Now, that may seem like a mostly benign thing to you, but that was against God's law. King Uzziah was of the tribe of Judah, and only those of the priestly tribe of Levi were permitted to do what Uzziah was determined to do. The office of the king was supposed to be separate from the office of the priest, and Uzziah was forbidden from doing what he set out to do. But apparently, he seemed to think that he, as king, should not have been forbidden from offering incense, so he practically pushed his way into the temple, until the scriptures record that he was stricken by God with leprosy. Some sort of visible sore broke out on his forehead as he sought to go where he was not permitted to go. The Lord struck him. King Uzziah, for about the next 10 years after that, lived in isolation. He was cut off from the temple. He was cut off from the palace. He was cut off from his family. He was effectively king in name only, and his son Jotham ruled in his stead. And then eventually, about 10 years later, in 740 BC or so, he died. That's the point at which the prophet Isaiah had a vision of God. Isaiah chapter 6 records these words: "In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple." This vision of Isaiah has always fascinated me for a number of reasons. It's a passage worthy of meditation, but it is interesting to me that the physical king in Jerusalem, Uzziah, had effectively been dethroned. The throne was vacated for a decade as King Uzziah lived with leprosy in isolation, and now at Uzziah's death, the throne was very much empty. But when there was an earthly, empty throne, Isaiah had a vision of the Lord seated upon a throne in heaven. This last week, a long-awaited report was released from an independent investigation of a well-known Christian organization's late leader. Ravi Zacharias International Ministries had initiated an independent investigation into alleged misconduct by their late founder, Ravi Zacharias. Zacharias had died of cancer in May of last year. And prior to his death, there were allegations of sexual misconduct and concerns over impropriety involving Ravi. And then the report was finally released this last week, confirming what many people had feared might be true. And it's heartbreaking. My heart breaks because of this. To acknowledge that Ravi was a twisted and broken predator. No excuses can be made for his evil actions. And maybe it's according to God's mercy that Zacharias died before all of this ultimately came out. Sadly, like Uzziah 28 centuries ago, Ravi's heart was lifted up to his destruction, and in the end, his leprosy was exposed. And when kings fall and earthly thrones are seen for what they really are, we need to remember that there is a God that is 3 times holy, who sits eternally enthroned in heaven. Something to think about. See you next time.